This is the 25-year winter, how championship college football went dormant in the North. This 5-part podcast series will dive into the failings of Northern college football and the dominance of Southern college football in the modern era. I'm Doug Lesmerises.
I'm Bill Landis, and we're the co-hosts of the Kings of the North College Football Show. This is episode 4. It's about attitudes.
It's finally here. The cheating episode.
Pace yourself. We're calling this the attitudes episode, not the cheating episode. It's about the approaches to college football in the North and the South during our time period and how it affected on-field results. The South unapologetically got after it in football and won. The Big Ten in the North sometimes seem more focused on amateurism and keeping their money than winning games. There's going to be some library talk and discussions of other terrible scandals. Prepare for a share of hypocrisy, so it's not just cheating by paying players.
But isn't this what you, I, and a lot of people listening have been waiting for? If we're going to explain how the South dominated the North in college football for 25 years, isn't bending, breaking, or ignoring the rules part of it?
So do you think that only the South cheats?
Definitely not. But I'm not sure there's much dispute that the South cheated either more or cheated better. Choosing your label based on volume, more, or effectiveness, better, that depends on who you are and probably who you root for. And then there's whether you think cheating in college football is a good or bad thing.
Or something in between, during a time when the sport became big business and wasn't sharing the money with the labor force.
When it comes to player acquisition and the ways we've been saying the South was more aggressive and would do anything to get players,
there's old-fashioned aggressiveness in landing those players. And then maybe a little or a lot of something else.
In 2017, CBSSports.com talked to 26 of the then 130 major college football head coaches about cheating. That anonymous survey found 57% of coaches saying only 10% of schools, or fewer, cheated. The authors thought that, frankly, a bit naive. And only one coach believed more than 30% of schools willingly cheated in a major way. But there was an anonymous quote in there that got at the cheating cultural divide. Quote, I would say in the SEC, 80%. Everywhere else, about 20%. Another coach discussed a cheating idea while acting as if it was common knowledge. There is that deal in the SEC and the ACC where they're funneling money through churches. Funneling through churches. Author John U. Bacon, for his 2013 book, Fourth and Long, The Fight for the Soul of College Football, talked on a regular basis with then Penn State linebacker Mike Motti, a New Orleans native who came north to play for the Nittany Lions. In his later book, Overtime, Jim Harbaugh and the Michigan Wolverines at the Crossroads of College Football, Bacon wrote this. Quote, Motti and I shared stories we'd heard about coaches channeling money through churches, a practice that few Southern politicians or reporters would dare investigate. A few paragraphs later, Bacon quoted Harbaugh thusly, hard to beat the cheaters.
Wait, what? That's going to take some time to unpack.
Believe me, we will. But for now, can we acknowledge the clear perception that the South cheated more? And the idea that if there's that much smoke, it's not just barbecue. There's probably fire.
I think that's fair.
And as columnist Dan Wetzel, then of Yahoo Sports and now at ESPN, told me on Kings of the North in January 2025, quote, it's a lot easier to go under the table when you're near the table. And who was closer to the table? Southern schools near more good Southern players. Wetzel then explained the specifics of a story he heard about one recruitment using Tech and State to stand in for real SEC teams.
The mortgage on his mother's house is controlled by the bank downtown, and that banker is State, not Tech. Okay, mom doesn't have to pay the mortgage if he goes to State. She will if you go to Tech. The principal of the school, who can help with the transcript, is for State, not for Tech. The power bill has been getting paid for 4 months, for like 2 years by someone from State, not someone from Tech. So the moment he goes on the visit, the power goes off at their house. There is institutionalized, organized setup to do that. And so he goes to State not Tech, right? In the Fansville thing. If you're coming in from Northern U and trying to get in on that, it's already done. It's not just here's a bag of cash. It's like, no. We already got this set up, and mom and everybody around and Uncle Jim's job and all the different stuff is set up through state, not Tech, and it's certainly not Northern School U.
I buried myself in the NCAA infractions database for a few days. I've become quite enamored with that searchable public clearinghouse. You can really get lost in there. Under the definition of major infractions in football, 15 of the current 16 SEC teams have at least one, and the SEC total was 63 cases. Of the current 16 Northern Big Ten teams, we're not counting USC and UCLA, 13 of 16 had at least one. The total, 35 cases. So that's 63 SEC to 35 Northern Big Ten. Now, of what we call the 34 Power Conference Southern schools, there were 31 of 34 teams with at least one major football infractions case, all but Vanderbilt, Duke, and Wake Forest. The total, 119. Of the 28 Power Conference Northern schools, 23 of 28 were cited, all but Iowa, Purdue, Northwestern, BYU, and Boston College. The total, 66. So that's 119 south to 66 north, an average of 3.5 cases per Southern school and 2.4 per Northern school. And 11 Southern schools had at least 5 cases. Auburn, Alabama, South Carolina, Florida, Mississippi State, Texas A&M, Oklahoma, Florida State, SMU, Arizona State, and Houston. The North had 2 schools with at least 5, Notre Dame and Colorado.
Major infractions as a definition, that can cover a wide range of violations, right?
Absolutely. That includes everything from making too many phone calls to recruits at improper times. Wisconsin got pinched on that in 2025. To large-scale calculated plans to gain an edge in recruiting. Tennessee got nailed for 18 level 1 violations in a 2023 ruling that went on for 127 pages and included phrases like, quote, coaches and staff felt emboldened to commit hundreds of violations. Wisconsin's negotiated resolution involving level 2 violations was 13 pages long and admitted it was mostly a new coaching staff misunderstanding things, and the violations were discovered by the Badgers' own phone monitoring system.
So not all cases are created equal.
Correct.
But over a span from the 1950s to the current day, among major football powers, the South almost doubled the North's violations.
Also correct. Can I make one more comparison of violations? I have so much research.
Yeah, but we got to get to the bag man, but go ahead.
Okay, in 1954, Notre Dame earned its first NCAA football violations for conducting impermissible workouts. It's so quaint. To quote the report, said tryouts having consisted of wind sprints, calisthenics, reflex tests, running, passing, and dummy blocking. The legend Frank Leahy was the Notre Dame coach at the time of the violations, but he was retired when the ruling came out, and he was mad. He wrote an article in Look magazine. Audrey Hepburn was on the cover, and accused Big Ten teams of persuading the NCAA to investigate Notre Dame. And then he put the tryout violations in context, saying the NCAA should focus on real abuses like, quote, the tendering of money and gifts to football players under the table, and the notable lack of concern with the kind of education a player is getting off the field.
He could have said that in 2004, not 1954.
Agreed. And okay, now, an Ole Miss violation from 1959. A booster adopted a high school player to try to get him to go to Ole Miss.
Isn't that the plot of The Blind Side?
Yes. But Ole Miss was also doing it 50 years before Sandra Bullock. To quote the NCAA ruling, the council's conclusion that the principal reason that the alumnus decided to establish the guardianship was because his future ward was an outstanding football player and one whom the alumnus earnestly hoped would attend the University of Mississippi.
So what happened to the player?
He went to Arkansas and threw for 74 yards in his career.
And what happened to Ole Miss?
A year's probation. And then more football violations in 1986, 1994, and 2017. The 1994 NCAA report concluded there were, quote, very significant violations of NCAA bylaws governing recruiting, improper inducements, extra benefits, ethical conduct, and institutional control. In 2017, oh, mama, quote, Mississippi fostered an unconstrained booster culture, particularly in boosters' relationships with the football program and their involvement in recruiting. This is now the third case over 3 decades that has involved the boosters and the football program. Even the head coach acknowledged that upon coming to Mississippi, he was surprised by the craziness of boosters trying to insert themselves into his program. At the hearing, Mississippi's chancellor acknowledged his institution's problem with boosters, characterizing one instance as disturbingly questionable. The report continued, this case is symptomatic of an out-of-control culture that has existed for decades.
And Ole Miss is not the Southern exception, I assume. It's more like the rule?
Yep. How about this report from 1985 on Florida football violations from between 1979 and 1983? As the Gators were barred from bowl games and TV appearances for 2 years, the NCAA president said, quote, the violations in this case appeared to represent a deliberate and calculated effort on the part of the university's football coaching staff over a 5-year period to do anything necessary to achieve a superior football record. And then there's this case from 2004, when Mississippi State football got a 1-year bowl ban. The NCAA quoted University President J. Charles Lee from the hearing. As you already know, these are volatile times for football in the Southeast because of the intense competition and the proximity of schools. The same out-of-hand rivalry exists within our state. Some fans of our institutions not only want their team to win on the playing field, but seek to discredit their rivals through the media and through NCAA investigations. The cultural environment for football, coupled with the instantaneous power of the internet, is making allegations, character assassinations, and innuendo an accepted behavior. This is the president beaten down by modern SEC football. After that, Mississippi State coach Jackie Sherrill retired and later sued the NCAA, settling out of court 15 years later. He'd previously quit at Texas A&M, with the school hit by violations that occurred during his tenure. And then there was a round of recruiting violations on his watch at Mississippi State in 1996. The NCAA said Sherrill and his staff should have known better. But, quote, the former football staff engaged in improper recruiting activities throughout this period, seemingly more concerned with purported conspiracies to discredit them by supporters of rival teams rather than with attentive compliance with the rules.
Okay, this is the cheating episode.
It's so much, Bill, isn't it? So much. But it is also the attitudes episode. You can hear the institutional desperation in some of these reports about Southern rule breaking. Yes, the North did it too. But if you're applying the flip test, imagine the same thing in the North. Could you imagine a Big Ten president at a lower level football program in this era saying these are volatile times for football in the North because of the intense competition?
No, I can't imagine the Purdue or Minnesota president dropping that on us.
And that attitude in the South that you didn't see across the North to the same degree, that's how you got Bagman.
A 5,000-word investigation entitled Meet the Bagman, 10 Rules for Paying College Football Players, dropped on the Banner Society website on April 10th, 2014. Over 2 months, the author spoke with different bagmen representing SEC programs about how they broke rules and funneled money to players. And just to be clear, the bags we're talking about, they were filled with cash.
I think almost anyone around college football remembers when that story came out a decade ago. The author, Stephen Godfrey. And here he is. Hello, Stephen.
Hi.
Thank you for being
remember
here.
where I was.
Yeah, I bet you do.
Yeah.
Kind of a big thing that happened in college football. How did Bagman come to be, Stephen? And where did the idea come from, and how did you go about reporting this?
The genesis of Bagman was that I was pitching different ideas about college football to my editors at SB Nation as early as 2012. So we're talking 2 years of different ideas that not all the ideas had to do with the illegal economy in the NCAA for paying players. This was just stuff that was going on in college football. And my sort of top editor at the time was a guy named Spencer Hall of Every Day Should Be Saturday fame. And one day, we were discussing something unrelated to the illegal paying of players. And he just said, well, how do you know that? Like, where did you get that? And I said, oh, one of the bagmen told me. And he said, he kind of stopped and he said, like, well, tell me more about that. And so we discussed that I had over the years earned favor with some individuals who were involved in different parts of the process of the old pay-for-play economy, I guess you can call it. It's hard. We never really bagman was the most popular word because it sounds sexy, but we never really put a label on player compensation before NIL, okay? And so I said, yeah, bagman told me that. Kind of the old way of thinking was like, if you see something, say something. And really, you curried a lot of favor as a national media personality in college football if you admonished the cheaters and venerated this, the establishment. So we said, screw all that. Very punk rock, I guess, and said, let's write a story about these people and let's acknowledge this thing that everybody knows is going on. That was what kind of killed me. And it's funny to listen to the introduction from y'all. I still to this day don't understand why it was received the way it was. Because I thought I was picking up the scraps on something that was just like a little dirty, which I didn't mind. I didn't mind doing the dirty stuff, the the criminal aspect of it all or whatever. I just thought we all knew this happened. The stories that I was hearing at the time were coming from the boosters and bagmen who were primarily in the SEC, not alone, primarily. So it was easier to start there. It's also easier to I had these contacts at SEC schools primarily. There were some other schools in other leagues. It was just the SEC, the ACC. We talked to a couple Big Ten people later on. But in the South, it just made sense to say oh, well, this story is about trying to get this kid. So if the rival school is trying to get this kid, can I go there and see? Will someone trust me enough to talk to me? And so that's how it inadvertently became the SEC.
You mentioned the responses you got to it. So I guess a multi-pronged question here. Were there differences in the responses you received from the North and the South, which is to say the Big Ten and the SEC? Were those responses the same or different? And since you mentioned it, I'm also curious if the NCAA had any kind of response and said hey, man, why don't you show us your work here since we're not able to do it ourselves?
Well, let me start at the beginning. The response in the South was, "Hey, this is awesome!" And it was a lot. They kind of wanted to play a game of Clue, where it's that's definitely Auburn, that's definitely Florida, that's definitely whatever. Or it's if it was a Kentucky fan, they're like, "Oh, I knew Louisville was doing that." It's again, it did extend outside of the conference. The response I received in the Midwest and Big Ten, the traditional footprint of the Big Ten Conference, by and large was, I can't believe they, the SEC, are doing that. There was an othering, okay? The second most common response was, I know Ohio State's doing that. Okay, that was the second most common response. And then the third was absolute aghast shock, and that was just from Michigan fans it's a very large fan base. They're very online, if you will. So there was more variation in the style of response in what you could call the North or the Big Ten footprint, whatever you want to say about it. The NCAA never said anything to me face to face officially, or anyone. I've talked to people who are now not employed there, who have told me the truth, which was when it came out, they had meetings about it and they were really upset. But they also used it sort of as an invective to double down on wherever they could and go after particular individuals, because they really wanted they I don't know if this is good or bad, but I guess, I couldn't imagine doing that job at that time, but the people who were doing that job at that time kind of took it as like a call to action. People who were pissed were the Southeastern Conference. They were furious.
Why were they mad?
It was some sort of old school gentleman's agreement that I broke, I think.
And when you say Southeastern Conference, you mean the league offices?
I mean the league offices. I got smeared across the SEC, especially. I mean, some really powerful corners of college football as an industry in the media for writing that story. I didn't lie. I didn't do anything wrong. I just wrote what I wrote. But the SEC, to answer your question, Doug, I broke the gentleman's agreement. It was like this omerta. But the last time I checked, that's my job. My job was not to adhere to or bootlick to any kind of establishment that I covered. And, to this day, that doesn't make sense to me. But I have learned that the history of sports journalism is kind of pocked with a lot of like cheerleading and favoritism and a kind of desire to be adherent rather than challenging. So they were furious because I took something that everyone knew happened behind closed doors and I just put a name on it. I put it up front. And again, we decided to frame the story around the SEC because this is 2014. Think about the summer of 2014 for a second and where we're at in the history of college football. Think about the successes that the SEC have just sort of put on their belt, right?
For sure, absolutely.
The Saban era is sort of kind of transitioning into the second reign of Nick Saban. He's gone through and played his return from the NFL, reestablished, recruiting dominant, destroying everybody, and this is before he kind of changes into that Kiffin era where he adapts. Meyer has won the titles. Meyer's at Ohio State at this point, but Meyer's had his own era. And then you're coming off of the launch of the SEC network, which I think is about this time. I know it's out there at this point. A&M and Missouri have come over. The SEC has never really been more powerful than it is in this moment. And they're about to enjoy another kind of decade-ish. Everything stacks in their favor. It's very hard to make someone so large and invulnerable care at all, right? Like, how does the mouse bother the elephant? But by putting a name, by putting a platform to the function of their personnel process really, really bothered a lot of people. And it was something that they couldn't ever really shake until NIL dawned.
So you said you live in the South, you have roots in the South.
Mm-hmm.
Could you have done this same story in the North? Could you have centered this story in Big Ten country and found the same type of, to use your word, ubiquitous setups?
I think it would have been too lopsided. I think the function of the story only works. When I talk about function, I'm talking about the dynamics that we wrote about and the procedures, like the logistics of this is what we do and why we do it, is because it was such an aggressive buyer's market. There was a guy who I talked to, one of the bagmen, who had passed this along from another guy. He was like passing along like an axiom. And he said, because I kept asking, I was like, well, how do I know how ubiquitous this is? How do I know if this thing is everywhere? And he said, the best rule of thumb you can tell people is that if you cheer for a team that's good, that's on national television, that has a number on the left side of their name on Saturday, they're doing some dirt in some way, shape, or form, which is not something you could test in the market at the time, right? There was no way to do that. There's no way to vet 100 schools or the 50 schools that end up in the top 25 the most frequently. But every conversation I had anecdotally would back that up. The problem in the Big Ten, the problem in the Midwest, what I found was it kind of mirrored Big Ten football at the time. So you had Ohio State. By the way, this is pre and post Urban. This has nothing to do with a particular era of Ohio State, I think. I think Urban certainly installed Southeastern Conference mentality, which we all know about. But Ohio State comported itself as not an SEC school as if they were sort of aspiring to that, but they were able to function like an SEC school in recruiting and in bagman culture when they needed to. I think the same could be said, obviously, of what was going on in Miami for decades, plural, and then also Southern California under Pete Carroll especially, but then into the Kiffin and Sark eras. So I could have written, if you'd have sat me down and said, do the Big Ten, I think I could have done it. But the problem is the little pieces and anecdotes inside of Bagman are about sort of even keel or sort of competitors on equal footing in the South who are equally as passionate and aggressive in what they're doing to get a kid. And what the Big Ten was, as it was sort of told to me, was it was like a hierarchy. It was like it was the SEC was America. It was a buyer's market. It was an open market. It was an open economy. And then you had this sort of like old school European thing of a hierarchy. You got these schools you're going to go to, and they're going to offer, and they might do this, and they're like they have their system. But what you didn't have at the time, or at least what I couldn't find any evidence of, was like the kind of cavalier cowboy booster at a true have-not. And I'm not talking about like, I'm just going to pick on somebody at the time, but like a Bill Cubitt, Illinois, okay? It was not necessarily saying like, all right, we're going to pull this 4-star from Ohio State or Penn State or Michigan State. And we're going to do $50,000 in cash to the family, and we're going to do it over this period of time. Like that, you didn't have that cowboy cavalier thing at the bottom. Whereas in the South, you had more fan bases who were committed to an under-the-table process of some way, shape, or form, to where then you could draw, again, as a seller, as a family, you had more offers in. You had more people who were interested in paying you. So if you were a kid being recruited by 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 SEC schools, you probably had more financial offers, individual offers, than you would have if it was 5, 6, 7, 8 Big Ten schools. And then I would lump the ACC in with the South, certain ACC programs, and I would lump, obviously, like we said with the Big 12. But where the Big Ten's problem was in this was that you didn't have enough people aggressive in the market. That doesn't mean they wouldn't do things. That doesn't mean this didn't happen in the Big Ten. It's just we're just talking stats here. It's just number of people doing it, to what degree, and at what number are we talking about? That's where they lacked. It was an underdeveloped economy. It wasn't like it wasn't happening. I can't say this enough. Like the Big Ten's no stranger to institutional corruption at individual universities. It's just that if you were a 4 or 5-star kid in Birmingham, or you're a 4 or 5-star kid in Dayton, then the neighboring schools were going to offer you more cash more aggressively in Birmingham than they were in Dayton. And that was the difference that I didn't really get into at the time, but that was the big difference.
You're sort of touching on this, and we hear this a lot. At least I've heard this a lot. This idea of cheating more versus cheating better, and Doug did mention this earlier in the episode. Yeah. What's your view on that, I guess? And if the South did cheat more and cheat better, is that a black mark, or is that just something like a box you have to check in order to win in college football?
That's a great question. I think the back of that is a really good question, because it gets into, I think it's hard to do this and dance around morality. And I don't want to measure action as passion, which I think a lot of SEC fans took my story and turned it into, we just care more. And I've never believed that in my career, because I've seen people elated or gutted in Boise, Idaho, or Seattle, Washington. I've seen people, I've met Boston College fans who are too emotionally invested in Boston College football. So I don't believe that. I've never believed that in my career. Do you have more fans who care more about a 6-win SEC team in 2014 than you might have more fans who care that much about a 6-win Big Ten team? Possibly, yes. I think that was true at the time. I think cheating better at this period of time was about cheating more. So the sheer action of doing it and not getting caught, even if you made an offer that you didn't get back, was a big deal at the time. And so that, as this advances from the early 2010s into where the levee's kind of breaking with NIL, cheating better was about refining that process. And so we're not there yet in history. At this point, it's just let's get their attention. Let's get the uncle's attention. Let's get the mom's attention. Let's get the kid's attention. Can we scrub a lease? Get the kid a car? Because doing those things at the time was a signifier of a serious commitment to football. And that, I think, that prerogative, that mindset was absent in too many Big Ten programs.
So you brought up morality.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to talk about this more in a moment. Jim Harbaugh is going to come up again. But do you believe there is or was a morality to cheating? And more importantly, do you think the South believed that paying players was against the rules but was the right thing to do? And did they believe in their hearts, as they were trying to be more successful on the football field, did they also think they were on the right side of history by giving these amateur athletes some money in the moment?
Oof. Yes, but there's a pretty big asterisk next to that, because it's funny. What's happened in 2025 as we record this? A lot of those same individuals who used to act like Robin Hood at, here's $20,000 in cash to come play for our university. They sure do gripe a lot about the market value of a kid now that everything's above board. Because guess what? Got a lot more expensive. Okay. Hey, what's cheaper? Hiring undocumented labor in cash or actually going out and finding a contractor to work on your house? So I don't. If I have a minor regret at the time, I really beat the pulpit on the idea that these guys were going to be on the right side of history, and technically they are. But I don't think that they're like the nobility of this. I think has been grossly blown out of proportion. I think these guys were, by and large, serving their own interests. These guys were serving their desire to win. They did not have any moral reservation about what they were doing, though, for sure. There was never I don't know about this. No, it was definitely the opposite. I think they were really, really content with what they were doing. Also, they knew they could do it. They'd get away with it. So
we're a decade. Not to make anybody feel old, we're a decade beyond when this story came out. Stephen, what have you seen, I guess, from we'll call it the northern response, and how the North, the Big Ten, the Midwest, however you like to label it, has adjusted to what you sort of laid out 10 years ago and what the new realities of college football are now?
I think that before you get to the legalization of compensation, both the House settlement and then also in name, image, and likeness, I think there's a combination of things happening. There's a begrudging acceptance of the market economy by more northern schools, or more Big Ten schools specifically. Simultaneous to that, you are having the series of the ex-SEC head coaches, not really Southern people. They're not Southern. I mean, Urban Meyer's from Ohio. James Franklin is from Pennsylvania. But you're seeing the SEC-trained coaches apply SEC sort of tactics and principles and logistics, and now it's creating success. So that, over time, starts to build a cultural acceptance of, we're going to have to do something like this. And then I think what galvanizes the Big Ten and kind of brings us to present day is, to go back to Michigan for a second, if I took all of those people who made bad faith arguments, but if I took them at good faith, all they were doing was waiting for this to become acceptable or legal or something they could put on their taxes. I don't know. And they would rain down cash, right? And so far, they have held up to their end of that. And so now in 2025, I look back at this story and I don't see it so much as the SEC sort of kind of flaunting and kind of like shaking the ball as they cross the end zone, the way that it came across in 14. Now I look at it as a more populated, richer part of the country. If you think of them as competing businesses, it was almost like the Big Ten sort of like kind of looked back at this younger, smaller, more maverick company in their field doing something that made sense to them and saying, well, we're just going to steal that and do it bigger. But we need these things to happen. Now, it's not one-to-one because the Big Ten never pot committed to the underground market economy. But once certain legislative levers were pulled, what we have seen in a short amount of time, in a small sample size, is that the Big Ten has now said, okay, great, sure. Guess what we can do? We can write checks because there's a lot of us. And so now I look back at that story and they sort of took it as an instruction manual as long as they could kind of tweak a few things. So
thanks to Godfrey for all that. Clearly, the North is ready and willing to pay players these days now that it's allowed.
Things are changing. For most of the past 25 years, the North-South attitudinal divide was encapsulated in 2 4-word phrases. We will go D3, and it just means more.
The year was 2016, and the SEC wanted a slogan. Commissioner Greg Sankey met with the league's marketing partner, unhappy with the SEC branding at the time. Quote, "We'd never hit it right," he said several years later, according to a story by On3. "I walked in and I said what we have doesn't work, and I was asked, well, what do you think sets the Southeastern Conference apart? And I said, what we do just means more. They asked me to explain that. And that, at least according to the commissioner, is how It Just Means More was born." Officially crafted by the SEC's new ad agency, the Richards Group, the It Just Means More slogan was apparently intended to convey the full-life contributions of the SEC, how it permeated the lives of its fans in a multitude of ways. Early commercials included a video of a surgeon in a Florida bandana, a woman playing the violin, and a baby in a Vanderbilt helmet.
Whatever it is, here, it just means more.
The founder of the Richards Group, Stan Richards, resigned in 2020 after saying in a meeting that a motel commercial presented to him was, quote, too black, reportedly adding that it might offend the motel chain's, quote, white supremacist constituents. Several clients left the Richards Group. As of 2024, Ad Age reported that the SEC was still a client of the agency, now known as TRG. Anyway, the slogan. It's stuck, and it still slaps. Everyone in college football has heard It Just Means More, and everyone knows exactly who it's about. And what does it mean to you, Doug, and to most college football fans?
That the SEC loves football more than anyone.
Right. Maybe it was intended to encapsulate the entire Southeastern Conference experience. In 2019, a blog post on the SEC website titled What It Just Means More Really Means wrote about acts of kindness among SEC fans. But I think most of us absorb those 4 words as meaning the SEC is crazier, louder, and better at football on Saturdays. And college football just means more because the South just has less. They explain it that way themselves, turning the absence of pro sports or other cultural touchstones into pride in a single-minded obsession around their college football teams. Quote, "The Southeastern Conference was created in the midst of the Great Depression," Sankey said. "The economic, the educational impact, the social, the cultural impact, the sports impact, the rallying point that our universities represent in our region. It just struck me as having so much more depth and meaning where there might not have been Major League Baseball teams or NFL teams. In 1965, there were 22 professional football teams and none were in SEC territory. The Miami Dolphins and Atlanta Falcons came into existence in 1966. And with the SEC expanding into Texas and the NFL expanding south, there are now 9 NFL teams in the footprint of the current SEC.
So there's the early history without pro football. And what was the other thing that helped craft the SEC's identity and attitude? Oh, yeah. Take this passage from Tribal, a 2015 book by Florida State professor Diane Roberts about college football in the South. Quote, "Below Mr. Mason and Mr. Dixon's lordly line, white people clung to college football like a security blanket crafted from Robert E. Lee's frock coat. Maybe we were poor. Maybe we were country. Maybe we didn't have no Harvard or Yale. Maybe we lost the war. But we were good at football."
Boy, she's pulling no punches. She's a huge football fan, by the way. She writes that as an insider to Southern ball, not an outsider.
Roberts continued, quote, college football in the South has operated on the premise that 11 Southerners could whip one big Yankee institution, Notre Dame, Penn State, Michigan, Washington, refighting Antietam and Shiloh on a 100-yard field. So the North won the Civil War, and that gave the South an inherent college football advantage because the sport meant more to them? Can I watch that? It just means more commercials. Start it with Lee surrendering at Appomattox and end it with Nick Saban lifting a trophy?
That's why Big Ten Commissioner Jim Delaney's new slogan for his conference to counter "it just means more" was, quote, "we won the war." No, I'm kidding.
I gotta say, "we won the war" has a certain ring to it. When we were starting our show, I pondered, it just means the appropriate amount, but that got a little wordy.
How about "we will go D3" as a response? It's not a direct quote, but it might be the sentiment that tells the story of the North in this era, in contrast to "it just means more."
Delaney served as the commissioner of the Big Ten from 1989 to 2020. Progressive in many ways, he kickstarted conference realignment. He created the first conference TV network. He was probably just as well known as a champion of the status quo when it came to certain parts of college football. He loved the Rose Bowl. We covered that before. And his affair with the game held back a true national championship game for years. And he loved amateurism. The Big Ten has always loved amateurism. The SEC wasn't formed until 1932, but the Western Conference, which would become the Big Ten, was created in 1896. The founding schools got together to make some rules around safety as college football had become a dangerous game. But as reported in the book, Creating the Big Ten, Courage, Corruption, and Commercialism, the league also wanted to make sure athletes weren't making money. Charged with enforcing its own rules, the Big Ten banned one Minnesota football player in 1901 for profiting from his football skill. He had, quote, competed in a fat man's race and had accepted $5 as the winner of the race.
That's Big Ten speed.
Which is fine, as long as it's amateur Big Ten speed. In 1923, Illinois was found to have used some semi-professional players. 9 were ruled ineligible, and the league decided to clean itself up. Wrote author Winton Solberg in Creating the Big Ten, quote, the exposure of professionalism in college athletics created a great stir. For the first time, some Big Ten athletic directors realized that intercollegiate athletics could not exist except upon the amateur principle. He continued, in light of the scandal, some athletic directors changed their views on amateurism. Now they all favored rigidly enforcing the rules. That's 1923. Here's part of Delaney's testimony from the Ed O'Bannon lawsuit in 2014. You might have heard of that case, kind of greased the wheels for college athletes to be paid. Delaney's defending amateurism in a way that could be out of 1923. In pursuing a college degree and playing college sports, we try to focus on a balance between the two. And I think when you start dealing with 18, 19-year-olds and talking about inducing them to go to a college for $50,000, $30,000, $20,000, the decision about where you go to college is not the critical point. The decision then is about whether or not you're going to make $30,000 versus $40,000. And so my view is that the individual should have the choice, and the choice should be athletically and educationally based. And the idea that the highest bidder would win for the name, image, and likeness is anathema to the idea of a student choosing where to go to college. That's just over a decade ago. We now have players making outside money off name, image, and likeness. And starting in 2025, we have athletic departments directing $20.5 million into the pockets of their athletes. Jim Delaney's version of college football is gone. The North's version of college football for much of this losing era is also gone. But the North is now able to compete at a higher level because it did not get its way. It did lose this war. Picture Delaney signing surrender papers. But in giving up and accepting the new world, the sport has changed for the better, and changed for the betterment of the North. That just makes how hard the Big Ten was hanging on to the past even crazier. The "we will go D3" idea that we've referenced is from a declaration Delaney filed in the O'Bannon case prior to his testimony. He didn't want to be forced to share money with players. Quote, "It has been my long-standing belief that the Big Ten schools would forego the revenues in those circumstances and instead take steps to downsize the scope, breadth, and activity of their athletic programs," Delaney wrote. Several alternatives to a pay-for-play model exist, such as the Division III model. These alternatives would, in my view, be more consistent with the Big Ten's philosophy. Again, consider the reverse. The SEC threatening to go D3? Impossible. Delaney basically admitted later in an O'Bannon deposition that he was bluffing, that, quote, others within the Big Ten would disagree with his view.
Yeah, Ohio State wasn't going D3, brother.
But Bill, this is still the image of Delaney that sticks with me, the threat to go D3.
I think of two things when I think of Jim Delaney. One is Rutgers and Maryland joining the Big Ten for cable TV eyeballs, and the other is going D3.
And he was really holding on to the past in his O'Bannon testimony, which you can still read online. He was asked about a hypothetical where the Pac-12 started paying players and the Big Ten did not. Delaney said the Big Ten would stop playing against a Pac-12 team in the Rose Bowl. He gave up the Rose Bowl. On one hand, he was gathering as much money for the conference as possible by adding Penn State, Nebraska, Rutgers, and Maryland between 1993 and 2014 and creating the Big Ten Network in 2007. On the other hand, paying players was the worst thing possible to him. It was exponentially hypocritical.
The Big Ten would probably say it was trying to balance the big-time money in the sport with the foundational principles around education and amateurism it wanted to maintain. We've made fun of them in this series for talking about libraries, and they did like libraries, but they were so good at making money.
The basic equation in modern college sports is football equals TV ratings equals money. Football runs college sports because it's the biggest TV draw, and TV ratings are what lead to huge TV contracts. The Big Ten got really good at the TV and money parts of the equation, while almost accepting second-class status in the football part of things. This is what Delaney told The Athletic in 2023 in a retrospective about conference realignment and his view of what expansion meant to the Big Ten's media rights deals. The SEC got TV money by winning. The Big Ten did it other ways. Quote, "They were always paid well because they've won 12 of the last 15 football championships," Delaney said of the SEC. "I mean, we were doing it on the basis of a good middle class, good upper class, good markets, good branding, good timing, but it wasn't because we were mowing people down." So it was okay to destroy tradition if it was in pursuit of adding cable customers in the New York area by grabbing Rutgers for the league, but somehow going all out in football or keeping up with the South in under-the-table payments was beneath them?
Look at the names the Big Ten chose when it split into football divisions in 2011. The choices were legends and leaders. This is Delaney in the press release. Quote, "Legends is a nod to our history and to the people associated with our schools who are widely recognized as legends. Leaders looks to the future as we remain committed to fostering leaders, the student athletes who are encouraged to lead in their own way for the rest of their lives."
Pretentious. I preferred Big Ten black and Big Ten blue, like you're physical and beating people up in football because you aren't afraid to admit you like football. Even more in line with the Big Ten thinking was the approach to expansion. The Big Ten talked about the AAU a lot, and that's not summer basketball. It's the American Association of Universities. It was a requirement for Big Ten expansion candidates, an expansion clearly driven by TV, which is the middle part of the money football equation. But they had to couch it in education. So being part of the AAU, a group of 69 research universities, of which nearly half don't field major football teams, was a big deal. In his O'Bannon testimony, Delaney confirmed it as the first requirement for conference admission. Currently, 17 of the 18 Big Ten schools are members. Nebraska was when it joined the Big Ten, but then it got booted out of the AAU. Current SEC members of the AAU, 5 of 16. Let's briefly talk academics a little more. The U.S. News and World Report rankings of colleges for 2025, for what they're worth, 16 of the 18 Big Ten schools in the top 100. The SEC had 5 of its 16 in the top 100. The 2 lowest ranked Big Ten schools by that particular academic list, Oregon at 109 and Nebraska at 152. And you know how many Northern football fans care about that? Probably none. They care that Oregon is a modern blue blood with resources and national title aspirations, and that Nebraska made a bowl last season for the first time in 8 years.
So are we mad at the Big Ten for caring about academics?
No, not mad. But if they really cared about academics the way they say they do, maybe they would go D3. But I think the Big Ten in this era cared more about ideals than individuals. I think it cared more about perception than reality. Maybe it's admirable in some ways to try to live in both worlds, big-time football and high-level academics, but so many of their moves were obvious money grabs. Why is Rutgers in the Big Ten? That it's hard to give them credit. Now, with 4 new West Coast teams, the Big Ten stretches from ocean to ocean. Makes for a fun map. Meanwhile, the SEC added Texas and Oklahoma, 2 schools that really care about football and are the 5th and 6th winningest programs in history. Maybe the Big Ten could have added Texas and Oklahoma once upon a time, but Oklahoma's not in the AAU.
When you conveniently emphasize education this much, it also bolsters what you're really fighting for: amateurism. South Carolina coach Steve Spurrier proposed in 2011 that SEC coaches pay their players with their own money. His idea was a $300 a game payment, which could have cost a coach about $300,000 a year. He got 6 other SEC coaches on board for the idea, and when it didn't work the first time, he got all 14 to go along the next year. An idea like that eventually became a reality when scholarships that included the full cost of attendance were allowed by the NCAA. But Northern coaches didn't really start talking about paying players until a decade later. Around 2020, Michigan coach Jim Harbaugh, we told you we'd get back to him, started advocating for it. He kept talking about directly sharing TV revenue with players, including before the 2023 season.
What I don't understand is how the NCAA, television networks, conferences, universities, and coaches can continue to pull in millions, and in some cases, billions of dollars in revenue off the efforts of college student athletes across the country without providing enough opportunity to share in the ever-increasing revenues.
Now, Harbaugh was in the midst of an NCAA sign-stealing investigation, and this might have been a smart way to change the subject. But he had been on the topic for years, and he had been on the bandwagon of what's best for players. That's not where the Big Ten had been. While the South was cheating more or cheating better, it could argue that the rule breaking was actually helping players. The heck with the NCAA. Let's get some money in the pockets of these kids. And hey, maybe it'll help us win too. If you wanted to spin some Southern Robin Hood tales, you could. Meanwhile, in the North, for too long, the Big Ten had protected policy, but it hadn't protected its people.
In this century, the NCAA considered leveling the death penalty on 2 historic powerhouse programs that stand as cultural representatives of Northern and Southern football. One was Penn State, the other was Alabama. Imagine a football season without either of them. The circumstances of those 2 situations couldn't have been more different. Their stories tell us something about priorities and failings in the North and South. Alabama was punished in 2002 for football reasons. Penn State was punished in 2012 for the most serious of real-life reasons, the abuse of children. When it comes to the northern view of Southern rule breaking, you can find ideas expressed like this one from Brett Bielema, the Wisconsin coach turned Arkansas coach turned Illinois coach from episode 2. When Urban Meyer, fresh from the SEC, arrived at Ohio State in 2012 and started recruiting more aggressively, Bielema spoke for a lot of the Big Ten when he famously said, quote, "I can tell you this, we at the Big Ten don't want to be like the SEC in any way, shape, or form." While staking those claims against perceived cheating and prioritizing the protection of amateurism, the Big Ten and the North in general often came across as high and mighty. We care about the right things. We have our priorities in order. Maybe football shouldn't mean more. Penn State coach Joe Paterno was seen as a bastion of those ideals. Named Sports Illustrated Sportsman of the Year in 1986, a rare honor for a coach, the idea of winning without cheating was front and center in the selection. Wrote Rick Riley in SI, "What makes some people doubt Paterno is the nature of the notion that he defies every year, that simply you have to use semi-pro kids majoring in profitable handshaking to win big in major college football. That Paterno can win without cheating is more than a lot of people can digest. Quote, I don't think people think it's possible," says defensive tackle Bob White. "They're dubious of Joe, think he's a phony. He's not. It is possible. We're doing it here." In winning and in losing, doing it the right way is an oft-cited Northern bromide. Win that way and you're honored. Paterno was coming off his second national title in 5 years when those words were written. Lose that way, and you might be excused. A month after Ohio State got blown out by Florida in the national title game in January 2007, Delaney wrote an open letter to Big Ten fans on the conference's website. The gist? The Big Ten might be losing to the SEC, but at least they're losing the right way. Quote, "I love speed, and the SEC has great speed, especially on the defensive line," Delaney wrote. "But there are appropriate balances when mixing academics and athletics. Each school, as well as each conference, simply must do what fits their mission, regardless of what a recruiting service recommends. I wish we had 6 teams among the top 10 recruiting classes every year, but winning our way requires some discipline and restraint with the recruitment process." Discipline? Restraint? Excuses. Hypocrisy. But there are no excuses for the scandals that have plagued the Big Ten and that have nothing to do with paying football players. As aptly stated in a 2024 article in the Marquette Sports Law Review, quote, "The Big Ten Conference, while celebrated for its athletic achievements and academic excellence, has been marred by a series of deeply troubling incidents involving sexual abuse, misconduct, and player mistreatment across several of its member institutions over the last 25 years. In areas where the Big Ten often acted as if it should set the standard, it has infamously fallen short again and again." Remember those quotes from the Mississippi State president from earlier in the episode about the, quote, "cultural environment for football leading to out-of-control booster behavior"? How about if your football culture lets a sexual predator operate in your football building? That's what the investigation led by former FBI Director Louis Freeh found at Penn State in 2012, that the all-encompassing dominance of the football program let assistant coach Jerry Sandusky get away with abusing children for more than a decade. From janitors in the football building who witnessed Sandusky showering with young boys, to the people in charge of the football team, athletic department, and university who heard things and took no action, Freeh said this at the news conference after releasing the report, quote, "They were afraid to take on the football program. The university would circle around it. It was like going against the President of the United States." If the SEC can be viewed as win at all costs, perhaps the best description of the Big Ten in this era is protect at all costs. Similar tragic cover-ups occurred at the athletic programs of Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State, and allegedly Indiana. At Ohio State, Dr. Richard Strauss, a team physician for 17 sports, abused at least 177 male athletes between 1978 and 1998, with an independent report concluding OSU coaches and administrators knew of Strauss and failed to stop him. HBO in the summer of 2025 released a documentary on the victims of Strauss. The title, Surviving Ohio State. During a similar period at Michigan, a team physician named Robert Anderson abused as many as 1,000 athletes over 4 decades, with university coaches and administrators also ignoring or covering up allegations. At Indiana, basketball players allege a former team doctor abused them, and they have filed a lawsuit. And at Michigan State, Dr. Larry Nassar was sentenced to at least 40 years in prison, and the university reached a $500 million settlement with at least 332 victims of Nassar in 2018. He abused young women athletes for nearly 2 decades as an MSU sports doctor between 1997 and 2016. These aren't the only things the Big Ten allowed to happen, but what unites cases like these specifically is a culture of silence that left hundreds of young athletes vulnerable to repeated assault. Yet at the same time, the Big Ten in 2015 floated the idea of what it called a year of readiness. It never got past the idea stage, but the thinking was keeping men's football players off the field or men's college basketball players off the court for their freshman seasons would help them adjust to college life. Freshmen had been ineligible in football and basketball until 1972, and now the league was considering moving back 40 years. It was the type of overly paternalistic thinking from the Big Ten that wasn't a surprise. But if you're so concerned about the well-being of your athletes, how come so many of your schools refuse to protect them from team doctors? This isn't breaking news. These Big Ten scandals have been public and remain so. The free report has been criticized by some, and we're not going to argue the details of exactly who failed the most and who bears the most blame, though the university president, vice president, and athletic director all got jail time. But in this episode about attitudes, we can see the distinction between how the North and South approached football. And the results speak for themselves. You know it by now. Between 1998 and 2022, 22 national titles for the South and 2 for the North. What the North maybe could have in place of those championships is a justified sense of moral superiority. They could perhaps cling to battles on a football field fought justly and lost, maybe, unfairly, to the cheaters. But there's too much scandal for that. Too many victims for that. If the North's attitude contributed to losing football games for 25 years, well, nothing was gained in the effort. It wasn't just the sexual abuse cover-ups. Under the heading Additional Incidents Occurring at Big Ten Conference Member Institutions, the Marquette Sports Law article outlines 7 more cases at Big Ten schools. Again, I didn't need a law article to remember them. It's part of who the Big Ten has been. There's the death of Maryland football player Jordan McNair during a summer workout, which led to allegations of a toxic football culture from several players, the firing of Coach DJ Durkin, and a settlement with both McNair's family and those players. There's the racial discrimination lawsuit filed by black players at the University of Iowa and settled for more than $4 million. There are the hazing allegations at Northwestern that led to the dismissal of football coach Pat Fitzgerald and dozens of lawsuits filed by former players. And between 2011 and 2018, Iowa and Nebraska football and Ohio State lacrosse and track and field had cases of athletes hospitalized for rhabdomyolysis brought on by overexertion in team workouts. Back to Penn State. Since those first steps in 2012, the university sued the NCAA to get Paterno's vacated victories returned. Many think the NCAA overstepped its authority. The NCAA reducing Penn State penalties regarding postseason bans and scholarship reductions acknowledged that. But everyone agrees on the wrong that Sandusky perpetrated around that program. And the threat in the moment about shutting down Penn State football was discussed, according to then NCAA President Mark Emmert. Penn State's interim president believed the threat to be real. As for Alabama, how does it feel to get back to recruiting violations after a list of abuses like this?
It certainly changes your perspective. You were pretty fired up to talk about cheating at the start of this thing.
Here we are now. On page 29 of the NCAA's 37-page infractions case against Alabama in 2002, quote, because the university is a two-time repeat violator with prior infractions cases in 1995 and 1999, and because the recruiting violations set forth in this report were some of the most serious in recent memory, the committee very seriously considered imposing repeat violator penalties, in particular, prohibiting outside competition, the so-called death penalty in the sport of football. Although the committee ultimately declined to impose a prohibition on outside competition, the committee emphasizes that this was a very close question, greatly influenced by the particular circumstances of this case and of the university's infractions history. The Birmingham News covered the heck out of this ruling when it came down on February 1, 2002. 11 different stories in the paper the next day, 4 in the news section and 7 in sports. The headline on the front page was Alabama branded a disgrace. The headline on the sports section was Shame on You. Alabama was banned from bowls for 2 seasons, put on probation for 5, and docked 21 scholarships over 3 years. The NCAA president said Alabama was, quote, absolutely staring down the barrel of a gun. These violations are some of the worst, most serious that have ever occurred. What did Alabama do? Boosters paid recruits tens of thousands of dollars. Nobody on Alabama's staff was cited for serious infractions. No players were harmed. Yet, Bama football almost went away. And 8 years later, it won the national title, the first of 6 in a 12-year span.
So what's our conclusion here?
Well, first, attitudes do matter in our discussion. The South and the SEC clearly cared more about winning, and that is a part of why they won more often.
And then, as you said, while the Big Ten seemed to find prioritizing football almost distasteful at times, they let so many things more serious than paying players occur under their noses.
So can we try to agree on a few things?
Sure.
The South cheated more often and or better than the North.
Yeah, I think that's right, mostly.
The cheating did give the South an edge that affected winning.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
The North, while certainly having schools that cheated at times, made sticking to the rules and emphasizing both education and amateurism part of its personality.
True.
And then a lot of what happened in the Big Ten was worse than the cheating in the SEC that the Big Ten looked down upon.
I think that's correct.
So what now?
Well, change, we think. I'm not sure it's rightly described as an attitude shift. It's a change in the structure and rules of college football that have allowed or even necessitated an attitude shift.
Meaning, if paying players is no longer cheating thanks to revenue sharing and NIL, then the North doesn't have to act like it doesn't want to be the SEC. It can just try to be the SEC and beat the SEC.
We've had 2 straight Northern national titles, 2 straight All-North national championship games. So that's what we'll wrap up with in episode 5, as college football changes and the North rises again. The 25-Year Winter, How Championship College Football Went Dormant in the North, is written and researched by Doug Lesmerises and me, Bill Landis. Michael Henahan is our producer and composer.
Ryan Nanny and Stephen Godfrey are our executive producers. To catch our daily college football show, search for Kings of the North College Football on YouTube.